December 25th, 1849, Christmas morning, Savannah, Georgia. The snow fell soft and silent over the grand houses of the wealthy, coating their sins in white. Inside the Whitmore estate, Martha Whitmore unwrapped her final gift with trembling hands. A beautiful cake of soap, ivory pale and smooth as bone, tied with red ribbon. The card read simply, "For your cleansing. From Clara, with love." What Martha didn't know was that the soap had been carved from her husband's own flesh. What she didn't know was that Clara, the house servant who had scrubbed blood from these floors for 20 years, had finally found a way to make Master Edmund wash clean. This is the story of Clara Washington, the woman who turned death into soap, vengeance into gift, and Christmas morning into Judgment Day. Before we continue with the video, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The lie burned like salvation. Clara stirred it slow in the iron pot behind the wash house, her dark hands steady against the steam that rose like prayers from the bubbling mixture. The December air was sharp enough to cut, but the fire beneath the kettle kept her warm. She'd been stirring since before dawn, adding ingredients no other soap maker would dare touch. Fat from the smokehouse, yes. Ash from the fireplace, certainly. But the third ingredient, the secret that made this batch different, lay wrapped in cloth beside her feet. Edmund Whitmore had been dead for 3 days. Heart failure, the doctor said, dropped right there in his study while counting the money from selling 2 children downriver. Clara had found him, just as she'd found everything else in that house. Broken daughters, bloodied sheets, promises turned to lies. But this time she didn't scream. She didn't run for help. She stood there in the doorway and watched him grow cold, and for the first time in 20 years she smiled. The funeral had been grand. Half of Savannah came to mourn the great Edmund Whitmore, pillar of the community, owner of 300 souls, father and husband and Christian man. They spoke of his generosity, his wisdom, his firm but fair hand with his property. Clara served tea to the mourners, eyes down, voice silent, while they praised the man who had torn families apart like breaking bread. But Clara had always known how to wait. She had waited through the selling of her mother, waited through the whipping of her brother, waited through the night Edmund dragged her into the study when she was barely 15, and waited through the years that followed when he returned again and again, each time leaving her to scrub the evidence from her thighs. She had waited through the birth of the daughter he would never claim, and waited through the fever that took that baby before she could even speak her name. Clara had learned that patience was a kind of poison. It gathered in the blood, slow and silent, until one day it was ready to do its work. The way Edmund used to watch her when she cleaned his study, eyes following her movements like a cat watching a mouse. The way he would call her into that room late at night, when the house was sleeping and his wife was heavy with laudanum. The way he would whisper things in her ear that made her skin crawl. Promises and threats wrapped in silk and delivered with bourbon breath. She remembered the first time, when she was just 15, scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees while he sat behind his desk pretending to read. She could feel his stare like heat from a fire, could hear the way his breathing changed when she bent to reach under the chairs. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, thick and strange. "Clara," he had said, setting down his book. "Come here." She had known even then what was coming. Had seen it in the way other girls moved when they came back from cleaning the master's room. Had heard it in the whispers that stopped when she walked by. But she was 15 and alone and owned, so she went. The night after the funeral, when the house was drunk on grief and whiskey, Clara returned to the study. Edmund lay in his coffin, dressed in his finest suit, hands folded over the Bible that had never guided his actions. She looked at him for a long moment, remembering the weight of his body, the smell of his breath, the way he used to whisper that this was her purpose, her place, her blessing from God. She pulled the carving knife from her apron. Her mother's knife passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter, hidden and cherished and sharp as judgment. Clara had never used it for anything but peeling apples and slicing bread, but tonight it would serve a different hunger. She worked carefully, reverently, like a woman preparing communion. The knife was small, and the cuts were clean. She took only what she needed from the places hidden by the suit: the soft flesh of the arms where the sleeves would cover, the meat of the thighs where the coffin would hide. Each piece went into the cloth bag beside her, still warm, still part of the man who had owned her body, but never her soul. When she was finished, Edmund looked no different. Peaceful, even. The undertaker had done good work. No one would know that he was no longer whole. Clara kissed her fingers and pressed them to his forehead, not in love, but in completion. "Now you're useful," she whispered. She sealed the coffin herself. The soap-making began that night and continued for 3 days. Clara had learned the craft from old Sarah, who had died the winter before, taking her secrets to the grave. But Clara remembered everything: how to render fat until it was pure and white, how to mix lye until it bit like truth, how to stir with purpose until the mixture thickened into something that could wash away any stain. Old Sarah had been more than a soap maker. She had been a keeper of secrets, a woman who understood that some things needed to be washed away completely. She had taught Clara not just the craft, but the philosophy behind it. "Soap don't just clean the outside," Sarah used to say, stirring her own mysterious mixtures. "Real soap, good soap, it cleans the soul. Takes away what don't belong, leaves behind what does." Clara had always wondered what Sarah meant until now. Now, standing over her own pot with Edmund's flesh bubbling into lye, she understood. This wasn't just soap. This was transformation. This was justice rendered into something useful, something beautiful, something that could finally make clean what had been dirty for too long. The flesh cooked down easier than she had expected. It smelled like pork at first, then like something older, something that had been waiting a long time to be transformed. She added lavender from the garden, rosemary from the kitchen, sage for cleansing. By the time she poured the mixture into the wooden molds, it smelled like heaven. The process was almost meditative. As she stirred, Clara found herself thinking about all the years of silence, all the nights she had scrubbed floors while Edmund watched her like prey. She thought about her daughter, the baby who had lived for only 3 days before the fever took her. The child Edmund had never acknowledged, never claimed, never mourned. The little girl who would have grown up beautiful and doomed in this house of horrors. The soap hardened over 2 days, turning smooth and pale, beautiful enough to sell in the finest shops. Clara carved each bar with care, shaping them into perfect rectangles, polishing them until they gleamed. She made 12 bars in total, each one containing a piece of Edmund Whitmore, each one a small act of communion. She kept 11 for herself. The 12th, the most beautiful, she wrapped in fine paper and tied with red ribbon. The card was written in her careful hand, the letters she had learned in secret while the master's children played. "For your cleansing, from Clara, with love." Christmas morning came cold and bright. The Whitmore house sparkled with decorations, green boughs and red berries and candles that cast golden light through the windows. Martha Whitmore sat in the parlor in her black dress, surrounded by gifts from friends and family, all trying to comfort the grieving widow. She was a small woman, gray-haired and soft-spoken, who had spent 25 years pretending not to see what her husband did in the dark corners of their home. Martha had her own secrets, her own guilts. She knew about the girls who disappeared from the house. She knew about the children born in the quarters who looked too much like her husband. She knew about the sounds that came from the study late at night, when she was supposed to be sleeping off her laudanum dreams. But knowing and acting were different things. Martha had been raised to be a lady, to turn her head and close her eyes, and pretend that evil was something that happened to other people, in other houses, in other lives. She had perfected the art of selective blindness, of hearing only what she chose to hear, of seeing only what she could bear to see. Now, sitting in her parlor in her widow's weeds, she felt the weight of all those turned heads, all those closed eyes, all those years of willful ignorance pressing down on her like stones. Clara served breakfast on the finest china, moving between the dining room and kitchen like a shadow. She watched Martha open gift after gift, smiling politely at the flowers and books and jewelry, trying to look grateful when all she really looked was tired. Finally, there was only one gift left under the tree. Small, wrapped in brown paper, tied with red ribbon. Martha looked at the card, frowned slightly. From Clara, she read aloud, looking across the room. "Clara, dear, you didn't need to give me anything." Clara stepped forward, hands folded in front of her apron. "Wanted to, Miss Martha." "Something special." Martha unwrapped the gift carefully, the way women do when they expect disappointment. But when she saw the soap, her eyes widened. It was beautiful, ivory white and perfect, carved with tiny roses around the edges. She lifted it to her nose and inhaled the scent of lavender and herbs. "Oh, Clara, it's lovely. Did you make this yourself?" Clara nodded. "Made it special. Just for you, for cleansing." Martha turned the soap over in her hands, feeling its weight, its smoothness. "It's the finest soap I've ever seen." "Thank you, dear. I'll treasure it. Use it well, Miss Martha. Use every bit." That night Martha drew herself a bath. The house was quiet, the visitors gone, the children asleep in their beds. She was alone with her grief and her secrets and the beautiful soap that had been made just for her. She slipped into the hot water and worked the soap into a rich lather between her palms. It smelled like flowers and herbs, but underneath there was something else. Something warm and familiar, like the smell of her husband after he came back from his midnight visits to the quarters. Martha frowned, but the lather was so rich, so cleansing. She rubbed it over her arms, her shoulders, her face. The soap felt different on her skin, heavier than normal soap, as if it carried weight beyond its size. As she washed, Martha found herself thinking about Clara. 20 years that woman had worked in this house. 20 years of cleaning and cooking and serving, watching everything, saying nothing. Martha had always been kind to Clara, or tried to be. She had given her extra food at Christmas, had not punished her when she was slow with her work. But now, washing with Clara's soap, Martha began to wonder what Clara had seen, what Clara knew, what Clara had been thinking all these years while she scrubbed blood from the floorboards. The soap was lasting a long time. Martha had been washing for nearly an hour, but there was still plenty left. She rubbed it over her chest, her stomach, working up a lather that seemed to glow in the lamplight. The water was getting cold, but Martha didn't want to stop. Something about the soap made her feel like she needed to wash more, scrub harder, get cleaner. She found herself thinking about Edmund's hands. How rough they had been, how they had grabbed and taken and hurt. She scrubbed at her own hands with the soap, trying to wash away the memory of letting him touch her, letting him do what he wanted because it was easier than fighting, easier than admitting what kind of man she had married. The soap was getting smaller now, worn down by all that washing. Martha held the sliver up to the light and saw something strange. A thin dark line running through the white like a vein. She squinted at it, turning the soap in her fingers. It almost looked like... But no, it couldn't be. She washed until the soap was gone, until there was nothing left but slippery water and the scent of herbs. When she finally stood up from the bath, her skin was pink and clean, cleaner than it had ever been. But she didn't feel clean. She felt like she had been marked, like the soap had left something on her skin that water couldn't rinse away. Over the next few days, Martha found herself thinking about the soap constantly, She would be sitting in the parlor, reading or sewing, and suddenly she would be thinking about Clara's hands making that soap, Clara's face when she gave it to her, Clara's words, "Use it well. Use every bit." Martha began to notice things she had never noticed before. The way Clara moved through the house like she knew every secret corner. The way Clara's eyes followed her husband's portrait on the wall. The way Clara hummed while she worked, old songs that sounded like warnings, and Martha began to remember things she had tried to forget. The nights when Edmund would slip out of their bed and return hours later, smelling of something she didn't want to name. The sounds that came from the quarters sometimes, crying that stopped too suddenly. The way certain women among their slaves would avoid looking at Edmund, would step aside when he passed, would send their daughters to work in the fields rather than in the house. One week after Christmas, Martha was cleaning out Edmund's study when she found his ledger, the one he had been writing in when he died. She had never looked at it before. Business was not a woman's concern. But now, washing her hands with the last sliver of Clara's soap, she opened it and began to read. The entries were mostly numbers. Purchases and sales, profit and loss. But scattered throughout were other entries, written in Edmund's careful script. Names and dates and payments. Sarah's girl Molly, sold to Alabama. Ruth's boy Samuel, sold to Mississippi. And then, in Edmund's handwriting, a note that made Martha's blood freeze. Clara's baby, born dead. Buried behind washhouse. C said nothing. Martha dropped the ledger. Her hands were shaking, soapy from washing, and she realized she was crying. Clara's baby, born dead. But Martha remembered that winter, 5 years ago, when Clara had been sick for weeks, pale and thin and moving like she was in pain. Edmund had said it was just the fever. But now Martha understood. She understood everything. Clara found her there an hour later, sitting on the floor of the study with the ledger in her lap and tears running down her face. Martha looked up when Clara entered, and for the first time in 20 years, she really saw her. Saw the strength in Clara's shoulders, the intelligence in her eyes, the patience that had been worn smooth by decades of waiting. "You read it?" Clara said. It wasn't a question. Martha nodded, unable to speak. Clara walked to the window, looked out at the yard where a small grave lay hidden behind the washhouse. She would have been 5 years old this winter. I named her Hope, even though she never breathed. Clara. Martha started, but Clara held up a hand. "I want you to know something, Miss Martha. That soap I made you, I made it with love, real love. Not the kind your husband called love when he came to my room, but the kind of love that wants justice, the kind that wants truth." Martha felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What do you mean?" Clara smiled, and it was not a cruel smile, but it was not kind either. "I mean that soap was made from him, from Master Edmund. I cut the fat from his flesh while he lay in his coffin, and I rendered it down into lye, and I made soap that would finally clean something in this house." Martha stared at her, understanding flooding through her like ice water. I mean you washed yourself with your husband's flesh, Miss Martha. You scrubbed your skin with the man who owned my body for 20 years. And now, you know how it feels to have him on you, to have him inside you, to carry him with you even when you don't want to. Martha was shaking now, her hands pressed to her mouth. But Clara wasn't finished. Every night when he came to me, I would lay there and think about what I would do when he was gone, how I would make him useful for once, how I would turn his flesh into something that could finally clean the dirt he left behind. That soap was my prayer, Miss Martha. It was my communion. It was my way of making sure he finally served someone instead of just taking. Martha was weeping openly now. Not for Edmund, but for Clara, for the baby buried behind the wash-house, for all the years of silence and pain. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't want to know." Clara knelt beside her, took Martha's soapy hands in her own. "I know you didn't. That's why I gave you the soap. So you would know. So you would carry him the way I had to carry him. So you would understand what it means to be clean." They sat there together in the study, two women who had been shaped by the same man's cruelty, holding each other while the winter light faded outside the window. And for the first time since Edmund's death, Martha felt truly clean. Not because she had been washed, but because the truth had finally been spoken. Clara stayed in that house until spring. She helped Martha sell it, helped her pack her things, helped her understand what kind of man she had been married to. And when Martha moved north to live with her sister, Clara went with her. Not as a slave. Those papers had been burned in the fireplace along with Edmund's portrait, but as a companion, a friend, a woman who had finally found her freedom in the strangest of gifts. They say that Martha never used soap again that she could not make herself. She learned the craft from Clara, learned to render fat and mix lye and stir with purpose, but she never made soap the way Clara had made it that Christmas. That was a recipe that belonged to one woman, in one moment. When justice finally found its way into the world through patience and lie and love that had been twisted into something stronger than hatred. Years later, when people asked Martha about the war, about slavery, about the way things used to be, she would tell them about the soap. About the woman who had the patience to wait 20 years for her moment and the wisdom to know that sometimes the most powerful revenge is the gift that teaches truth. And Clara? Clara lived to be 97 years old. She never married, never had other children, never spoke much about the old days. But every Christmas, she would make soap for her friends and neighbors. Beautiful white bars carved with roses, scented with lavender and love. And if you asked her about her technique, about the secret that made her soap so fine, she would smile and say only, this: "Some things can't be taught. Some things can only be learned by waiting." The old women in the neighborhood said that Clara's soap could clean anything: blood, sweat, tears, lies. They said it could wash away sins that had been carried for generations. They said it made your skin feel new, like you were being born again every time you used it. But Clara knew better. She knew that some stains never come out, no matter how hard you scrub. She knew that some dirt becomes part of you, works its way so deep into your skin that you carry it forever. She knew that the soap she made that Christmas had not cleaned Martha or herself. It had only helped them understand what dirty really meant. The truth was the soap, not the cleansing. The gift was the knowledge, not the washing. And the love was the patience to wait 20 years for the moment when justice could be carved as carefully as fat from bone, rendered as thoroughly as hatred into something useful. When word spread through the county about what Clara had done, some called it madness, others called it evil. But those who knew the truth, those who had lived in houses like the Whitmore estate, those who had scrubbed blood from floors and pretended not to see, they called it something else. They called it necessary. The story spread in whispers through parlors and kitchens, through sewing circles and church gatherings. Women would lean close over their needlework and speak in hushed tones about the soap maker who had found a way to make her master useful. Some were horrified, others were awed, all were changed. In Charleston, a society lady threw away a cake of soap her house servant had given her, suddenly suspicious of its origins. In Savannah, a widow began inspecting every gift she received with new eyes. In Atlanta, a plantation mistress started making her own soap, never again trusting the hands that had once comforted her. But in the quarters, in the small cabins where the enslaved lived their double lives, the story was told differently. There, Clara became a saint of sorts, a woman who had found a way to transform suffering into strength, silence into statement, flesh into freedom. Mothers would tell their daughters about the soap maker who had the patience to wait, the courage to act, and the wisdom to know that sometimes justice comes not through violence, but through truth. Clara Washington died on a Christmas morning, peacefully in her sleep, her hands still soft from a lifetime of making things clean. They found bars of soap stacked in her kitchen, ready to be given as gifts, each one perfect and white and beautiful. The people in the town fought over who would get them, because everyone knew that Clara's soap was special, but none of them knew the secret. None of them knew that the first bar, the one that had started it all, had been made from flesh and rendered with love and given as a gift that was really a prayer. None of them knew that sometimes the most beautiful gifts carry the heaviest truths, and sometimes the gentlest hands can shape the sharpest justice. They buried Clara in the churchyard under a headstone that read simply, Clara Washington. She knew how to wait, but if you know where to look, behind the old wash house that still stands at the edge of town, you can find a smaller stone, unmarked and weathered, where a baby named Hope sleeps forever beneath the Georgia clay. And they say that sometimes, on Christmas morning, when the light is just right and the air is still, you can smell something like lavender and herbs drifting from that grave. Not the scent of decay or sorrow, but something clean and new, like soap made with love and patience and the kind of truth that can only be carved from waiting. If this story touched something deep in your bones, it's because some truths can only be told through gifts. Some justice can only be served with patience. Some love can only be expressed through the careful transformation of pain into something useful, something beautiful, something that finally makes clean what has been dirty for too long. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this story to keep history alive.